loud. Awesome blossom. Okay. I think it's Wednesday, so I'm going to start us off today with the rest of the literature. We heard on Discord that somebody loves the literature, and I hope, I was so wary of it, but it is so neat to have this this literature going on that is so fabulous. So I'm going to remind us here that we were, when last we left, we were talking about how in section 4 of SOSI, basically it was like, well, the revolution wasn't so revolutionary for other groups. And the first group that we're talking about as being not carried along by the American Revolution so much was the women. And we talked just a speck about Eliza Wilkinson out of South Carolina was like, look, just because we may be weaker as a group physically doesn't make us weaker mentally. And then the SOSI packet in like 2 kind of short paragraphs mentions 2 other women, Judith Sargent Murray and Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, our president, who we learned about in section 3. And I realized that because both of these women, Judith Sargent Murray and Abigail Adams, have pieces in the literature, that now would be the perfect time to go actually read what they said for themselves instead of about them, read that primary source. So when we last were here, we were looking at the literature packet, which is also linked, of course, to your academic Zoom recordings. And also in Classroom in general, there's a whole section of electronic versions of all of our packets. Again, we will print those out and give them to you, but we're only reading a couple of pages. And I decided that I would read aloud Ms. Murray's piece, as I will for Abigail Adams. Abigail Adams' piece is much shorter and lends itself beautifully to being read out loud for reasons I'll talk about in just a few minutes. But this woman who was taught in the ways of a lot of the men in her world in the mid 1700s, let me get the exact date for us here, 1790, late 1700s. She doesn't use what we would call conventional writing, but she makes some amazing, amazing points. So I am going to, we are on, if you're following along, I am on page 79 of the literature resource guide, not the SOSI, but the literature resource guide. And we just finished talking when last we left her, she had this wonderful line that said, if only people would, teach women their how to think in history and science and all kinds of other stuff. She said they could get closer to God and they'd have happier marriages, because if they married somebody who was very smart, they could have intellectual conversations with them in a way that they cannot now, because they are held back by the fact that they are not educated in the same way that the men are. And if they married somebody dumb, they wouldn't be miserably dumb along with them. They could be, their judgments would be invigorated, and they would be not as rare. Yes.
Sure. Anyway, you could, it may be only me, but that you can make this bigger, on just to a speck bigger.
Yes. How is that?
Great. Thank you. That helps. It doesn't have to be that big.
Is that too big?
It just needed a little bit. Looked very teeny to me. So
I can make it slightly
better
or worse.
No, it does not have to be this big. It can be smaller.
How about that?
Great. Excellent. Thank you.
All right. Perfect. Thank you for saying something. That's wonderful. Okay, so she's going to go on and state that I'm going to try to do both pieces today. So I will watch the time and make sure that we get there. But so Ms. Murray is going to go on next to talk about how men shouldn't worry if women become well educated. that if they're educated, they will let their domestic duties slip. Remember that they're in charge of like needlework and running the household and, you know, sort of raising the family. And she's like, hey, guys who are reading this, don't worry. We will still be able to sew and raise our kids and everything else, partly because sewing itself, it doesn't take up so much brain space. Like we don't need to sit there quietly focused so hard on this, which is why we gossip when we sew. And if instead of gossiping, we were allowed to be educated, we wouldn't gossip anymore so much. So here we are at the top of page, this is page 79 in the literature guide. And it says, will it be urged that those acquirements, meaning getting educated, would supersede our domestic duties, that they'd take over for our domestic duties and we would put them at a greater importance and therefore not do our domestic duties? I answer that every requisite in female economy is easily attained. And with truth, I can add that when once attained, they require no further mental attention. That's, you know, don't worry about it. We can do we can do both. Facts. Nay, while we are pursuing the needle or the superintendency of the family, I repeat that our minds are at full liberty for reflection, that imagination may exert itself in full vigor, and that if a just foundation is early laid, our ideas will then be worthy of rational beings. If we were taught early, we'll be smart and rational. If we were industrious, we might easily find time to arrange them upon paper, or should avocations press too hard for such an indulgence, the hours allotted for conversation would at least become more refined and rational. So if we're really good about time management, we might even be able to write down what we thought and like write books and treatises and essays and everything. But if we can't do that, at the very least, we could talk and you know, have our brains like not turn to mush. Should it still be vociferated that your domestic employments are sufficient for you ladies, I would calmly ask, is it reasonable that a candidate for immortality, for the joys of heaven, an intelligent being who is to spend an eternity in contemplating the works of deity, should at present be so degraded as to be allowed no other ideas than those which are suggested by the mechanism of a pudding or sewing the seams of a garment? Look, if we're supposed to die and go to heaven and be able to talk with God and the angels and appreciate all that is incredibly religious and theological, really, like we should just think about how to cook. Pity that all such censures of female improvement do not go one step further and deny their future existence. To be consistent, they surely ought. And this is like subtle shade throwing. She's like, why don't you just tell us we're not going to heaven? Because that's you're telling us we're going to heaven, but we're not going to have anything to talk about or understand there. Why don't you just tell us we're not going to heaven at all? Fact. If you're going to go that far, go farther. No, you're not going to say that, are you? Nope. So I have it. Yes, ye lordly, ye haughty sex, men, our souls are by nature equal to yours. The same breath of God animates, enlivens, and invigorates us. And that we are not fallen lower than yourselves. Let those witnesses who have greatly towered above the various discouragements by which they have been so heavily oppressed. And though I am unacquainted with the list of celebrated characters on either side, yet from the observations I have made in the contracted circle in which I have moved, I dare confidently believe that from the commencement of time to the present day, there hath been as many females as males who, by the mere force of natural powers, have merited the crown of applause, who, thus unassisted, have seized the wreath of fame. Since the dawn of time, there have been plenty of smart women, and they had to get there on their own without any of your help. I know that there are those who assert that as the animal powers of the one sex are superior, that their strength is superior, men's strength physically is superior. Of course, their mental faculties must also be stronger. There are people who say that because the men are stronger in their body, that they're stronger in their brain as well. thus attributing strength of mind to the transient organization of this earthborn tenement. But if this reasoning is just, man must be content to yield the palm to many of the brute creation, since by not a few of his brethren in the field, he is far surpassed in bodily strength. She's like, yeah, if strength in body equals strength in mind, then guys, take a look out in the jungle. Cause like, you know, the gorillas and the, you know, the horses, the oxen, the tiger, I don't, whatever they, you know, whatever, they're all stronger than men. I guess they're smarter than men too. Yep. Your argument's going down. Moreover, was this argument admitted, it would prove too much, for ocular demonstration evinceth that there are many robust masculine ladies and effeminate gentlemen. Yet I fancy that Mr. Pope, though clogged with an enervated body and distinguished by a diminutive stature, could nevertheless lay claim to greatness of the soul. And perhaps there are many other instances which might be adduced to combat so unphilosophical an opinion. So she's like, look, there are tough women and there are wimpy guys. And so you can't even say that, because you can't say, oh, the wimpy guys are dumb and the, you know, the strong ladies are smart. So sorry, it holds no water there. And she mentions Mr. Pope, very famous author, who was had some kind of growth hormone issue, sickness, something, where he only grew to be about 4'10", but he wrote incredible, you know, very well-known works of literature. And so it was like, you know, you can't tell me that he's dumb because he's small, because everybody, you know, loves his work. Do we not often see that when the clay-built tabernacle is well-nigh dissolved, when it is just ready to mingle with the parent soil, the immortal inhabitant aspires to and even attaineth heights, the most sublime, which were before wholly unexplored? So she's going to have a whole series of arguments where she talks about the earthly body, from dust to dust, from dust we were born, and to dust we will return. That's an Old Testament line in the Hebrew that has been translated and kept, right? And she's like, look, at the very end of people's lives, when they're the weakest and the frailest, do they not sometimes have the most insight and the most incredible ideas? So it's not a connection. She just keeps separating that idea of bodily strength and mental strength. Besides, were we to grant that animal strength proved anything, taking into consideration the accustomed impartiality of nature, we should be induced to imagine that had she invested the female mind with superior strength as an equivalent for the bodily powers of man, but waiving this, however palpable advantage, for equality only, we wish to contend. We don't want to be superior, we want to be equal, she says. I'm aware that there are many passages in the sacred oracles which seem to give the advantage to the other sex, to men, but I consider all of these as wholly metaphorical. And she's now going to talk about people in the Old Testament, including David. Now, David, you may remember from the story of David and Goliath. A small guy takes down a giant, and then he becomes king, and he writes a whole lot of psalms and a whole lot of prayers. But he has this other side to him, which is that, speaking of my mother going to see the movie Hallelujah, which was based on Leonard Cohen's song of Hallelujah, there's a whole part of David's story where he goes onto his roof and he sees Bathsheba bathing naked, and he's like, hot damn, she's beautiful. And he doesn't kill her husband outright, but he sends him into the front lines of battle where, who could guess, he dies in battle. And then he hooks up with Bathsheba. And her point with David, and then she's going to later on mention a whole lot of other people in the Old and New Testament, all men and all fallible, all having major issues. Her point being that men are not perfect and still we allow them to learn, and women should be given the same right. So she people in the Bible. Thus, David was a man after God's own heart. Yet see him enervated by his licentious passions. Behold him following Uriah to the death, and show me wherein could consist the immaculate being's complacency. God didn't just ignore that. God knew that he was human. Listen to the curses which Job bestoweth upon the day of his nativity, and tell me, where is his perfection? Where his patience? Literally, it existed not. David and Job were types of him who was to come, and the superiority of man as exhibited in scripture being also emblematical, all arguments deduced from thence, of course, fall to the ground. If you're going to quote scripture and tell me that men are better than women, I'm going to throw out some of the people who to this day we consider, I don't know how to say the heroes of the Bible, but they were not great people. She's like, look, they were weak. That it's all metaphorical. It's not like God blesses you and curses somebody. God knows we're human. The exquisite delicacy of the female mind proclaimeth the exactness of its texture, while its nice sense of honor announceth its native grandeur. And indeed, in one respect, the preeminence seems to be tacitly allowed us, for after an education which limits and confines, and employments and recreations which naturally tend to enervate the body and debilitate the mind, after we have from our early youth been adorned with ribbons and other gewgaws, dressed out like the ancient victims previous to a sacrifice, being taught by the care of our parents in collecting the most showy materials that the ornamenting our exterior ought to be the principal object of our attention, after, I say, 15 years thus spent, we are introduced into the world amidst the united adulation of every beholder. Praise is sweet to the soul. We are immediately intoxicated by large draughts of flattery, which, being plentifully administered, is to the pride of our hearts the most acceptable incense. So she's like, look, we are taught to make our minds duller and duller. And we're told that dressing up and ribbons and tchotchkes and things we put on our face and our hair and our dresses and everything else, that's what we're worth. And then we're brought into society at age 15, and that's what we are praised for. Oh, look how pretty you look. Oh, how lovely. Oh, I love your hair. Oh, it looks so great. And that praise is like incense to our souls, she says. We lap that up. We love that. It is expected that with the other sex, we should commence immediate war, and that we should triumph over the machinations of the most artful. We must be constantly upon our guard. Prudence and discretion must be our characteristics, and we must rise superior to and obtain a complete victory over those who have long been adding to the native strength of their minds by an unremitted study of men and books, and who have, moreover, conceived from the loose characters which they have seen portrayed in the extensive variety of their reading, a most contemptible opinion of the sex. So then we're introduced to men at age 15, and we have to fight against these people who have been taught, the men who have been taught from tiny childhood, that we are smart and we are discreet and we are they have been taught that we are dumb and they are smart, and we have to go up against that. Thus unequal, we are, notwithstanding, forced to the combat, and the infamy which is consequent upon the smallest deviation in our conduct proclaims the high idea which was formed of our native strength. And thus, indirectly at least, is the preference acknowledged to be our due. We have to do this. We have to fight for our right to be human, to be part of this pairing, to fight against what they think of women. And if we are allowed an equality of acquirement, let serious studies equally employ our minds, and we will bid our souls arise to equal strength. We will meet upon every ground the despot man. We will rush with alacrity to the combat, and crowned with success, we shall then answer the exalted expectations which are formed. Though sensibility, soft compassion, and general commiseration are inmates in the female bosom, yet against every deep-laid art, altogether fearless of the event, we will set them in array, for assuredly the wreath of victory will encircle the spotless brow. If we are given the chance, we will seize it. We will be okay with education. If we meet an equal, a sensible friend, we will reward him with the hand of amity, of friendship. And through life, we will be assiduous to promote his happiness. But from every deep-laid scheme for our ruin, retiring into ourselves amid the flowery paths of science, we will indulge in all the refined and sentimental pleasures of contemplation. And should it still be urged that the studies thus insisted upon would interfere with our more peculiar department, I must further reply that early hours and close application will do wonders. And to her who is from the first dawn of reason taught to fill up time rationally, both of these requisites will be easy. If we meet a guy who is supportive of us, we will make him happy for the rest of our lives. And if people are still wary of us learning this because we won't have enough time, we'll just get up early. That'll be fine. We'll just do 0 period for y'all because we can do that. I grant that this niggard fortune is too generally unfriendly to the mind, and that much of that valuable treasure and time is necessarily expended upon the wants of the body. But it should be remembered that in embarrassed circumstances, our companions have as little leisure for literary improvement as it is afforded to us. For most certainly their provident care is at least as requisite as our exertions. Studying is just as hard work as, what we do. Nay, we have even more leisure for sedentary pleasures, as our avocations are more retired, much less laborious, and hath been observed by no mean require that avidity of attention, which is proper to the employments of the other sex. We have plenty of leisure time. We'll be able to study. Don't you worry about it. We can do that because, while we're sewing, we can do other things. Listen to a podcast back in 1790. In high life, or in other words, where the parties are in possession of affluence, the objection respecting time is wholly obviated and, of course, falls to the ground. If you're rich, you have plenty of leisure time. Women can study. If they're rich women, they can just foist off all their chores on servants. And it may also be repeated that many of those hours which are at present swallowed up in fashion and scandal might be redeemed were we habituated to useful reflections. But in one respect, O ye arbiters of our fate, we confess that the superiority is indubitably yours. You are by nature formed for our protectors. We pretend not to vie with you in bodily strength. Upon this point, we will never contend for victory. Shield us then, we beseech you, from eternal evils, and in return, we will transact your domestic affairs. And this is so fabulous salesperson technique. She's like, let me end by giving you a little flattery. Listen, you're stronger than we are. You were born to protect us. So don't just protect us in this mortal life, protect us in the life to come, because after death, when we're living in eternity, for the rest of our lives, we will need you to protect us from external evils and beyond, in the grave beyond. Be our protectors, and in return, I promise you, we'll take care of the house. You don't worry about that. Yes, are not you equally interested in those matters with ourselves? Is not the elegancy of neatness as agreeable to your sight as to ours? Is not the well-savored viand equally delightful to your taste? And doth not your sense of hearing suffer as much from the discordant sounds prevalent in an ill-regulated family, produced by the voices of children and many et ceteras? Listen, if you have a wife who just gossips and talks about scandal and fashion, aren't you bored out of your mind? Are we done? Can we have a real thing? And she signs it Constantia, which, as I said, was her pen name for representing sort of multiple women. And then she says, in December of 1980, she wrote a letter to a friend, and she added this last page, and we're good for 4:30. And now assist me, O thou genius of my sex. I think a female she wrote to. While I undertake the arduous task of endeavoring to combat that vulgar and that almost universal error, which it seems has enlisted even Mr. P under its banners. The superiority of your sex hath, I grant, been time out of mind, esteemed a truth incontrovertible. Oh, she's writing, I think, to a guy who supports her point of view. And she's going to write all of this stuff about the Bible and how she's going to fight back with biblical quotes. In consequence of which every persuasion, every plan of education hath been calculated to establish this favorite tenet. Not long since, weak and presuming as I was, I amused myself with selecting some arguments from nature, reason, and experience against this so generally received idea. I confess that to sacred testimonies, I had not recourse. I couldn't look at sacred books because I'm a woman, so I just took from what I knew. I held them to be merely metaphorical, all these Bible stories that she knows of. And thus, regarding them, I could not persuade myself that there was any propriety in bringing them to decide in this very important debate. They don't work as arguments here. However, as you, sir, confine yourself entirely to the sacred oracles, I mean to bend the whole of my artillery against those supposed proofs which you have thence provided, and from which you have formed an entrenchment apparently so invulnerable. Okay, it's been 2 days since I read this, and I'm changing my explanation. I think she's writing to someone who does not support her. And he uses quotes from the Bible to say women shouldn't be educated, and she's about to take him down. So watch and learn, my friends, watch and learn. And first, to begin with our great progenitors, that's Adam and Eve. But here, suffer me to premise that it is for mental strength I mean to contend. For with respect to animal powers, I yield them undisputed to that sex which enjoys them in common with the lion, the tiger, and many other beasts of prey. So yeah, fine. Men are stronger physically, but therefore, but she's going to talk about why women are just as smart. Therefore, your observation respecting the rib under the arm, Eve was taken supposedly from Adam's rib, and at a distance from the head, et cetera, in no sort mitigate against my view. Well, she says, you say that woman was the first in the transgression. So for anybody who doesn't know the Bible story, 2 seconds or less, supposedly Adam and Eve lived in the Garden of Eden, and they were happy and oblivious. And a serpent came or a snake, right? And offered Eve the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And God had said, don't touch the tree of knowledge. And she ate it anyway. And then she realized she was given the knowledge of everything, including what was good and what was evil. And she realized, quote unquote, that she was naked and that Adam was naked and that was not good. That was evil, supposedly. And so she gives Adam, she says, Adam, eat this apple also, this fruit. Eat this apple. And then they both ate it. And for that, they were expelled from the Garden of Eden, right? That's the biblical story, that Eve sinned first, and then she persuaded she gave it to Adam, and Adam sort of sinned accidentally. And then they were both kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And as her punishment, she has childbirth pains and original sin and all of this other sort of terrible stuff. And Ms. Murray is about to take this down. She says, well, you say that the woman was first in the transgression, that she ate the apple first. Strange how blind self-love renders you men. Were you not wholly absorbed in a partial admiration of your own abilities, you would long since have acknowledged the force of what I'm about to urge. It is true that some ignoramuses have absurdly enough informed us that the beauteous fair of paradise was seduced from her obedience by a malignant demon in the guise of a baleful servant. But we, who are better informed, know that the fallen spirit presented himself to her view a shining angel still. Thus saith the critics in the Hebrew tongue, ought the word to be rendered. So she's like, yeah. Supposedly it was a snake, but we all know that it appeared to her, according to the Hebrew Bible, as a shining angel. So really what happened for Eve was a shining angel came down and offered her the apple from the tree of knowledge. And so Ms. Murray goes, I keep calling her Mrs. Murray because of Mrs. Murray, who just left the Stockdale Science Department. But Ms. Murray says, let us examine Eve's motive. Hark, the seraph, the angel, declares that she shall attain a perfection of knowledge. For is there aught which is not comprehended on one or the other under the terms good and evil? It does not appear that she was governed by any one sensual appetite, but merely by a desire of adorning her mind. A laudable ambition fired her soul, and a thirst for knowledge impelled the predilection so fatal in its consequences. She wasn't being shallow and frivolous. She wanted knowledge. She risked it all because she wanted to learn. Adam could not plead the same deception. Assuredly, he was not deceived, nor ought we to admire his superior strength or wonder at his sagacity, his wisdom, when we so often confess that example is much more influential than precept. His gentle partner stood before him, a melancholy instance of the direful effects of disobedience. He saw her not possessed of that wisdom which she had so fondly hoped to obtain, but he beheld the once blooming female disrobed of that innocence which had heretofore rendered her so lovely. So he looked at his partner, at Eve, and he wasn't tempted by knowledge. He just saw that she had been beautiful, and because she ate from the tree of knowledge, now she was sad and disheartened and not as beautiful anymore. To him, then, deception became impossible, as he had proof positive of the fallacy of the argument which the deceiver had suggested. So the serpent, or the seraph, the angel, said, eat this knowledge, and she eats it and gets hurt. And Adam can't pretend that he was like, oh, I want knowledge. He already knew the truth. Right in front of him is this person who has eaten of the tree of knowledge, done the wrong thing, and is hurt by it. And yet he eats it anyway. What then could be his inducement to burst the barriers and to fly directly in the face of that command, which immediately from the mouth of the deity he had received, since, I say, he could not plead that fascinating stimulus, the accumulation of knowledge, as indisputable conviction was so visibly portrayed before him. So God literally told Adam, don't eat that. Adam told Eve, God told Adam, don't eat that. So he can't be like, oh, I didn't know. He can't say he didn't know. He can't say he thought he was going to get smart. He has no defense. So what would cause him to eat that apple, even though God told him not to, and he could see that Eve had eaten the apple and was, unhappy by doing it? What mighty cause impelled him to sacrifice myriads of beings yet unborn? He cursed the whole human race for what? She said. And by one impious act, which he saw would be productive of such fatal effects, entail undistinguished ruin upon a race of beings which he was yet to produce for the rest of his time. What would make him curse all of mankind? Blush, ye vaunters of fortitude, ye boasters of resolution, ye haughty lords of the creation. Blush when you remember that he was influenced by no other motive than a bare pusillanimous attachment to a woman. All y'all who say that men are so strong, that men have the best willpower, that men who are the lords of creation, you better blush, because he was influenced by no other motive than a bare pusillanimous attachment to a woman. And pusillanimous means wimpy. And pardon me for saying it this way, but it's where we get the English word pussy from. Like when we say, I mean, it's such a derogatory term for yes, oof is right. It's such a derogatory term. Obviously, I'm not talking about the body part, but that is in fact where we get that from. But when we say that someone is being a pussy, which is terrible that it gets linked to female body parts, but it is literally, she's like, he was like, oh, she's pretty. Murray is saying, Adam looks at Eve and is like, yeah, God told me not to. Yeah, I, can't pretend I'm not getting it from the serpent. Can't pretend I'm getting it from an angel. Can't pretend I'm trying for knowledge. This pretty woman told me to, and I wimped out. By sentiments so exquisitely soft that all of his sons have, from that period when they have designed to degrade them, described as highly feminine. People say that women throw things over for cute guys. Boom! Gosh, she's like, this is terrible. Thus, it should seem that all the arts of the grand deceiver, since means adequate to the purpose are, I conceive, invariably pursued, were requisite to mislead our general mother, while the father of mankind forfeited his own and relinquished the happiness of posterity merely in compliance with the blandishment of a female. That it took the devil himself to convince a woman to do the wrong thing, and she was doing it for the right reasons. And the guy, because she was pretty. The subsequent subjection of the Apostle Paul explains as a figure, after enlarging upon the subject, he adds, this is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. So Paul totally punts it down. He's like, I don't know what this is a mystery. Who could know? Who could ever know? Now we know with what consummate wisdom the unerring Father of eternity hath formed for his plans. All the types which he hath displayed, he has permitted materially to fail in the very virtue for which they were famed. So she's going to have this. It should be a separate paragraph, but she doesn't believe in paragraphs. So now she's going to go through and take down every sort of major character in the Bible and say that, this is a stupid thing. The reason for this is obvious. We might otherwise mistake his economy and render that honor to the creature, which is due only to the creator. She says, the reason that God picked these men that had such huge faults was so that we didn't worship the men, we worshiped God. So she's gonna go through all these characters and be like, yeah, he was supposed to be brave, was wimpy. He was supposed to be well-spoken, he was terrible speaker. We're not supposed to worship the man in the Bible, we're supposed to worship God himself. I know that Adam was a figure of him who was to come. The grace contained in this figure is the reasoning of my rejoicing. And while I am very far from prostrating before the shadow, I yield joyfully in all things the preeminence to the second federal head. Confiding faith is prefigured by Abraham, yet he exhibits a contrast to affiance when he says of his fair companion, she is my sister. So she says Abraham is supposed to be like the most faithful, right? The first person to believe in a singular God and to destroy his father's idols. And he's supposed to believe that God will always have his back. But he gets scared and he claims Sarah as his sister instead of as his wife. It's a story in the Bible. Gentleness was the characteristic of Moses, yet he hesitated not to reply to Jehovah himself, which unsaint-like tongue he murmured at the waters of strife, and with rash hands he brake the tables which were inscribed by the finger of divinity. So Moses was supposed to gently lead people. And first of all, she doesn't mention this, but he kills somebody in Exodus. That's originally why it's gone away. But he also tells God, like, I can't do this. He talks back to God all the time. And when he comes down from Mount Sinai with the stone tablets with the 10 commandments, he gets so mad because they've built a golden calf that he throws the tablets on the ground and they shatter. He has to go back and make more. David, dignified with the title of the man after God's own heart, and yet how stained was his life. Solomon was celebrated for wisdom, but folly is wrote in legible characters upon his almost every action. Lastly, let us turn our eyes to man in the aggregate. Let's look at all men. He is manifested as the figure of strength, but that we may not regard him as anything more than a figure. His soul is formed in no sort superior, but every way equal to the mind of her who is the emblem of weakness and whom he hails the gentle companion of his better days. That, my friends, is how you take down an argument. Those of you in debate, man, like, boom, that's right there. That is the you know, the 2NR, just wrapping it all up. They barely say anything in terms of what we're supposed to appreciate from this in the literature, but it is so powerful to read her words. You know, she really talks about this idea that men were trying at the time to sort of keep their women in a bubble, in a safe space, so that they weren't, you know, hurt by the outside world and sort of were kept domestically. And she just makes such powerful and amazing arguments that it not be that. So in the going back to this, and we will not have time for Abigail Adams, but I will just put this up for just one last second. So in section 3 or section 4, just kidding, section 4 of SOSI, they say, you know, women were not really given, you know, equality for all. Again, we have Eliza Wilkinson and Judith Sargent Murray. Here she is, looking like she's about to take down every argument anybody ever said. And a wonderful quote from that same piece is about how, you know, at toddlerhood, no one can say like, oh yeah, toddler boys are so much smarter than girls. And in fact, a lot of parents would say that, you know, girls are sort of, you know, more verbal at that age. The guys tend to get their verbal abilities sometimes later, not everybody, obviously. But she's like, look, you know, but we separate them at age 2 or 3, and the girl gets taught how to sew and the guy gets taught science and science, you know, and math and Latin and Greek and all this other stuff, and boom. When we will, we'll take our break a little early, and if we finish early, because we have our fabulous exhumation of the Mastodon coming up. Next week, I will go over Abigail Adams's letter to her husband, where she's like, hey, yo, when you're making all these new laws, she writes it in 1775. This actually, her letter comes before Judith Sargent Murray's letter in the literature packet, but the SOSI packet lists them backwards. So I just did them backwards the way the SOSI packet has them. We'll talk about Abigail Adams's letter, and we'll read it because she's easier to follow, but she writes her letter to her husband in a very conversationalist way. And so she really, it's much easier as if I just read it out. If I read it out loud to you, I won't stop like I did with the Murray letter, I promise. But she just sort of, you know, chatters along, and it's cute. It's a nice letter. And she, you know, but it's sort of more colloquial and less, but both of these women write just so well. Just, love it. Wish Judith Sargent Murray had an editor, but that's it. All right, so I'm going to stop my share. I'm going to pause the recording, and I'm going to give you a 10-minute break if anybody has any questions or anything, and then we'll start art early. And if we end early, and if we don't end early, that's okay too. It's all good. We have the same guy we had last year, and Josie and Aiden are both from last year, so they'll know. All right, let me pause. We are now resuming recording. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, from our station break. We are going to talk about art and the exhumation of the Mastodon. So without further ado, let's go exhume a Mastodon.
This should be interesting. I'm trying to, there we go. No, I have to press buttons in a different order. There we go. All right. So before, of course, we get to the painting and the Mastodon and the dig and all that, we have to give a little intro to one Charles Wilson Peale, and that is 2 L's in Wilson for those of you playing the home game. He was born in Queen Anne's County, Maryland in 1741, studied to be a saddler in Annapolis, Maryland. Now, I imagine a saddler learns different ways to saddle horses. I did not go down that particular rabbit hole. My father would have known all about that. Anyway, he didn't become a saddler, which is why we're talking about him in the art section. Turned to painting in the 1760s, greatly influenced by the work of John Singleton Copley, who we've talked about multiple times. Remember that Copley, self-taught, father and stepfather, both died when he was young, took over an art studio at age 13, went to London to study with one Benjamin West and stayed there for the rest of his life. Wilson Peale met Copley in Boston in 1765. So Wilson Peale would have been about 24. Peale eventually found enough financing from several merchants and lawyers in the surrounding area so that he could also go on a trip to London to study painting with Benjamin West, who John Copley went to London because of Benjamin West. So these three are inextricably linked. Copley became really famous, went to London. Benjamin West became really famous, went to London. Charles Wilson Peale goes to London and comes back. So he goes to London, stays there for 2 years, establishes himself as a portrait painter when he comes back in the mid-Atlantic region of the colonies. So typical types of questions they're going to ask about these three. Which one came back? Charles Wilson Peale came back. He was highly nationalistic. Copley and West were probably both British sympathizers. Well, we know Copley was. And Wilson Peale, definitely an American through and through. So he moves to Philadelphia in 1776. Nothing going on, right? Nothing going on in 1776. Nothing to see here. So he's back home. He enlists in the Pennsylvania militia. He brought his painting supplies with him. So he didn't go to shoot at the British. He went to paint pictures of his fellow officers. He was commissioned to paint a full-length portrait of George Washington on the battlefield. This is that portrait. So this is, to me, not a very realistic head shot of Washington. We've seen multiple other headshots of Washington, the most realistic being Houdon, because he made careful measurements and a life mask of Washington. But this is Peale's rendition of Washington, 1779. This was done in the to honor his Washington's victories at the battles of Princeton and Trenton. Peale organized the first group exhibition of art by purely American artists still living in the United States. So Copley and Benjamin West need not apply. He organizes this group exhibition of art in 1795. So we're a country, Washington's president. There you go. I think Washington's president in 95. I can't remember when he left the presidency. I'll have to look that up.
I don't think so. I think I think the
1792 maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So by now, Adams is president. Well, what are you going to do?
Right, 1796, and then the transfer of power happens in 1800.
There you go. Art and nationalism, very, very deeply connected for Peale. He wants to combine them with both, and science, as we're going to see. Remember, John Singleton Copley and Benjamin West both moved to England permanently. Peale firmly committed to developing artistic talent and building institutions in the newly formed United States of America. He attempted to establish the very first fine art academy in our country. He called it the Columbianum. I can say that. It was closed a few months after its opening. I didn't go down that rabbit hole. I could have. You know, was there just not enough financing? Was there not enough people wanting to study fine art in the United States? I don't know. He also wanted George Washington, and it says here, George Washington was currently president. Maybe it's because he was past president. I don't know. Anyway, I'm not sure if this happened after 1779 or not. It doesn't really give dates on this, and I didn't look it up because they didn't put it in here, so I know it's not going to get tested, and that's my fault for not looking up the specific date. At any rate, try to establish the first art academy, and one of the mistakes he made, I don't think this was a deal killer, he wanted George Washington to act as honorary president of the academy, right? This is similar to what over in England they've done for a long time. The King of England was honorary head of the British Royal Academy. He wanted Washington. So I have a feeling he tried to set up the Columbianum, but while Washington was still in office. And that's why I got confused as to when he left office. But this was too much like what they've done in England for years and years and years. So the Jeffersonian Republicans didn't want to follow in Britain's example of having the leader of their country be honorary this and honorary that. They thought it was too king-like. Let's put it that way. Here's the work that we've seen before. Coaches certainly, and anybody who's been to Decathlon 1, 2, 3, or 4 years. This is the third time in the last 3 years, I think, that we've brought up Charles Willson Peale as part of our curriculum. He was committed to promoting science as art. He opened his own museum in 1786, right next to his home in Philadelphia. National museums were becoming really popular in Europe in the 1700s. The British Museum opened in 1759, the Louvre in Paris opened in 1793, and Wilson's project was tied to his national pride and his interest in demonstrating biodiversity of the country. There, again, and we're going to see this in the music, we certainly see it in the art, we're going to see it in the literature. The United States had a giant inferiority complex. We're a brand new nation, and people are throwing shade on us. It's like, well, you don't have great music, you don't have great art, you don't have great literature. Comes up again and again. So we're trying to prove, yes, we do in all these different areas. So we're trying to show, here's all the biodiversity of the country. How do we do that? Well, you have a museum where you can put it all on display. So he created this museum right next to his home in 1786. Collection included more than 90 mammals, 700 birds, and 4,000 insects. From last year's resource guide, art, it said 1,600 birds. So we went from 1,600 birds to 700 birds, boom, in one decathlon year. Are decathlon years like dog years? Well, in this case, they're bird years. Okay. At any rate, depending on what number you need to memorize, the birds were displayed in cases with painted backdrops showing natural environments. Very few of these birds, they're all, taxidermized, if that's a word. They're stuffed, right? A few still survive. His bald eagle at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology. There it is. Doesn't have the background here. The background wasn't saved, but here's the original bald eagle. His museum eventually was moved to the American Philosophical Society's Philosophical Hall, and then to Independence Hall, now incorporated as the Philadelphia Museum. This happened in 1822. So if you visited Philadelphia, which I have, and you've gone to Independence Hall, and if you've stepped inside the museum, this is the same museum that he started in 1786. This is a famous painting, self-portrait, the artist in his museum. Mentored countless young artists, including several of his many children, and he named many of his children after his favorite artists. So it specifically mentions Raphael Peale, Angelica Kauffman Peale, Rembrandt Peale, and Titian Ramsay Peale. So all of the following were children of Charles Willson Peale, except look for one of those coming soon to a question near you. I do want to talk about this, the artist in his museum. We can go to the brief link. You can actually go to a more thorough description of this painting right here in the link, but we'll use this right here to view some of the different aspects of this. Sorry, there we go. Yeah, they describe this on page 98, and even though this is not the painting that we're studying this year, it's a painting we studied 2 years ago or last year, I can't remember which, I think it was 2 years ago. And this description is on page 98. I'm going to read it right out of the resource guide. This painting by Charles Willson Peale shows Peale theatrically lifting a red velvet curtain as he extends his hand towards the viewer in a welcoming gesture. Part of the mastodon skeleton could be seen in the museum behind him, right? There's part of the mastodon that we're going to be talking about, peeking out from under the curtain. In the foreground, the viewer can see a palette on the right. You know what? I think I'm going to go to my link. I think that image has been cropped out. Oh, here's the palette. It's up here on the, I didn't see it. I was looking down here. I was looking at the turkey. Here's the palette on the table. There's a painter's palette. You put little dabs of paint on here. You hold it with your thumb going through the wood, and it's so you can have the paint and dip your brushes in the paint from. Okay. So in the foreground, the viewer can see a palette. On the right, a nod towards Peale's artistic abilities. On the left, a stuffed wild turkey perched over a kit of taxidermy tools. The juxtaposition of the palette and the scientific specimens is indicative of Peale's shared passions for both art and science. You can also see all of these little exhibits with the painted backdrops and the stuffed birds. Okay. Painted near the end of his life, 1822, close to the end of his life. The artwork dramatically encapsulates Peale's cultural legacy and his contributions to the nation. He died in Philadelphia in 1822. So here's the work that we're actually studying for this year. So if you can imagine, 1798, gee, is that the same year that our novel was published, or was that 1796? One or the other. 1798, imagine the evening news, except they didn't have stuff like that, so we're imagining it, right? Farmer in Newburgh, New York, discovers mastodon fossils on his property. Peale finds out about it, the whole public finds out about it. Peale purchases the fossils for $300 and secures excavation rights. He brings a team of 35 workers to New York, including his son, Rembrandt. Peale supervised the dig. They documented the process, sketching the bones as they were uncovered. The sketches used to create a detailed, dramatic painting commemorating the removal of mastodon skeleton from the pit. The 4-foot by 5-foot painting is a monument to Peale's achievement. Peale also, and we're going to get into detail on this in a little bit. In fact, on the next work, a little bit bigger. All of this here, I'm going to talk about while I'm pointing out things here. So this is the visual analysis of the exhumation of the mastodon by Charles Willson Peale. Includes a total of 70 individuals, 70 people in this scene. We could count, but you guys can count on your own. Remember, he only brought 35 workers with him. So why 70? Well, it includes scientists and family members who are not actually present at the excavation site. The neat thing you can do in a painting that you can't do in a photograph, well, I guess these days you can, with trick photography and now CGI, right? With paintings, you can put in people who weren't really there in the scene. Back in the olden days, 40, 50 years ago, you take a photo and you can't insert people in. Now you can insert people into the photo, so there you go. If you've never seen the movie by Woody Allen, where he's a chameleon basically, and he changes shape, he's inserted into all. Probably a more updated movie would be Forrest Gump, where he's put into these historical situations. Anyway, I digress. This painting includes 70 people. Half of them weren't there. Couldn't have been there. Only Peele's son, Rembrandt, was on the site. I think this might be Rembrandt right here. This, of course, is Charles Willson Peele, but this would be the rest of Peele's family. Peele not only included his second wife, who was dead, so see, she must certainly not have been on site. He also includes his third wife, and some of his other children, but not all of his children. So it includes his second wife, who is deceased, his third wife, most of his children. There you go. Also, if you'll notice, it was a dark and stormy night, or at least a dark and stormy afternoon. We say it's afternoon because there's some light, so there's storm clouds threatening. This gives a visceral sense of impending menace. Why would be impending menace? Well, remember that Willson Peele designed this whole setup here with this water wheel to get the water out of this area. The deeper they go in digging up the mastodon bones, they're finding water underneath the surface. And then, of course, if it's raining, it's adding to it. So they're trying to get rid of the water that's already there. And they're taking a lot of time and trouble to do that. If it starts pouring rain, sort of defeats the purpose. So there's impending menace. Peele, in his diary, described a thunderstorm interrupting his work. So we know this actually happened. And it also might be an allusion to one of his really good close friends back in Philly, who in Philadelphia at the time that he would have been friends with might have had something to do with storms. Benjamin Franklin and his experiments with electricity. That's the key to the answer to that question. So that's an illusion. Peele is positioned standing near his large water wheel of his invention. He invented this apparatus in order to get the water out. So again, showing his abilities as a scientist and artist. The wheel powered a pulley system that helped lower the water level. Peele, helped by his family, holds a detailed, oversized drawing of a mastodon bone. By the way, the Art Resource Guide does not mention this, but at that time, the word mastodon was not in Peele's vocabulary. He would not have called this a mastodon. He called it a mastodon a few years later. But
Quick question.
Yes.
A mastodon is like a mammoth?
Well, we could go down that rabbit hole, and I can include extra research because that is a rabbit hole I went down, but the Art Resource Guide does not get into it. So I hate to load people with too much information. But
well, maybe towards the end of this, we can like when you're done talking about it, I'm just trying to picture what they're digging up here.
Well, we will see it.
Okay, JK.
Yeah.
I'll stop talking now. Okay, bye. Muting.
That's all right. You just had a bone to pick with me. Okay, so Peele, helped by his family, holds a detailed, oversized drawing of a mastodon bone. Actually, I don't find that tremendously oversized once you see the size of this creature. This drawing here symbolizes how he drew support from his family in his creative endeavors, which is why he painted his second wife alongside his third wife because they both helped him in one way or another. That's pretty nice of his third wife. Anyway, Peale demonstrates his skills in art and science, his two passions. This is a multi-figure composition. It's very busy because the people are busy. This is similar to the classic history paintings. That was the #1 thing to be doing. Lots of figures, you see. The wooden scaffold at the center forms a pyramid that draws the eye to the water pit at the base. The verticality of the pulley, right? The water is getting pulled up vertically. That leads the eye upward from the murky depths to the bright blue sky in the distance, which situates the excavation as a journey from darkness to enlightenment. Now there's another painting, William Penn's Treaty with the Indians, where the Indians are in darkness because they're savages, and the incoming colonists off to the left of the painting are coming in by boat, and they're building a new city, and it's lighter on the left-hand side. So USAD also likes to do compare contrast, or what are they similar to? Does not mention this, the resource guide, but to me it's striking how it's dark on the right, light on the left. We're going from darkness to enlightenment type of idea, okay? So here are the bones that we alluded to in Ms. Scully's interjection. The mastodon in the museum, this is only the second skeleton ever reassembled at the time. There have been more since for display. Second only to an enormous ground sloth reassembled in Madrid, Spain in the 1790s. So they reassembled this giant sloth, actually known as a megatherium. This megatherium, Madrid, Spain. Okay, this was the first. Never heard of a megatherium. Well, this is the second, okay? Not every bone was recovered. I've got a bone to pick with that statement from the Art Resource Guide. Remind me, because I've done some more research here. Actually, what they should have said in the Art Resource Guide, not every bone from one single mastodon, completely, entirely one creature, was recovered. In reality, about 1 3/4 of a mastodon collectively was recovered, and they were actually had enough bones to build 2 mastodons, but the Art Resource Guide does not mention this at all. Anyway, we'll get to that in a moment. Rembrandt, remember this is his son, Rembrandt, created the substitutes for the missing bones. So they had to fill in. These tusks were missing, okay? Rembrandt worked on the project with Philadelphia sculptor William Rush and a formerly enslaved servant by the name of Moses Williams, who worked for the Peale Museum. The 3 of them working together created bones from carved wood and paper mache. And this is a cool little link. This is a really interesting article. I highly recommend it. Mysteries of the First Mastodon, and talking about how they've had to clean it up and stuff. And I thought this mastodon was still in the United States. And you find out that since like 1859, this Peale mastodon has been in Germany. It's been on display in a museum in Germany for the last about 150 years. Resource Guide does not bring this up. Anyway, this is the mastodon, 1798, Newburgh, New York, Charles Willson Peale, friend and contemporary of Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. excavated at 1801. Accounts tell us some parts disintegrated when they pulled them from the watery pit. The tusks fell apart and the lower jaw and several ribs were never found. But the skeleton was nearly complete. This becomes really interesting. The Peel family immediately began reconstructing the bones in Philadelphia for display in his museum in the same way I might have to reconstruct a broken statue using a support system. Peel, by the way, none of this is in the art resource guide. Peel drilled long holes through each piece of bone and used a hidden iron armature to assemble the skeleton. Armature is a nice section 1 art resource guide vocabulary term. While we don't drill into the bones anymore, Peel's method was strong and elegant, and the armature is still supporting the mastodon today. This photograph, ultraviolet photo of the mastodon, is really interesting. This photo reveals dark areas, top of the skull, tusks, and tail. Those are modern additions, while the bright areas are the original bones. So most of the mastodon was intact, but they had to create artificial stuff. Peel had an incomplete skeleton, had to make decisions about the missing parts. He chose to have the missing bones carved in wood in a style that made the replacement parts distinguishable from the original bones, meaning you can tell what's been added from what was originally excavated. There's clearly a difference. This is interesting. This realization stopped me in my tracks. This is a modern conservation concept, very atypical for the 1800s. In the 18th and 19th centuries, sculptors were often asked to restore and remake missing parts of sculptures so the damages were not noticeable. Today, we will still remake missing parts of sculptures, but we use materials that are different and distinguishable from the original, just like Peel did over 200 years ago. So in other words, 200 years ago, most of the people that would do things like that tried to make it look all the same, tried to make fake parts look like originals. Peel did what we do today to clearly show what was real and what was made up, which I think is really cool. It shows a sense of mind. It's the scientist in him thinking. Peel's son Rembrandt took charge of the replica wood bones, enlisting the help of Philadelphia sculptor William Rush and Moses Williams, former enslaved person working at Peel's museum. This is in the art resource guide. Bilateral symmetry and examples of bones from previous excavations allowed them to carve the shapes as scientifically accurate as possible at the time. From 10 feet away, the mastodon looks complete. However, from 1 foot away, the replica parts stand out like wooden sculptures, which they are. They suggest, but do not imitate, bone. They're beautiful. C and V-shaped chisel marks dot the edges of the pelvis, right femur, lower jaw to match the rough texture of real bone, but without hiding the wood carver's chisel. I've run a strong magnet along the wooden edges, but nothing magnetic was detected. If nails were used, they're buried quite deep, suggesting the use of wooden pegs instead. This is their group. Their frames conservator Martin Collar used a piece of cherry wood and 2 carving chisels to replicate the marks seen on these wooden bones. So they go to the trouble of how did they do this at the time, trying to recreate how they made this stuff. And then as they clean them off, they find something else amazing that was underneath. These blue numbers and letters painted on each rib, which helped them rebuild the mastodon. Brief return to America and more mysteries. This is the stuff the art resource guide does not mention, but since we have time, I find this fascinating. The mastodon left America in 1847 and has been in the collection of the Hess's Landemuseum Darmstadt in Germany since 1854. So 168 years, right? In preparation to loan the mastodon back to America for the first time in 172 years, they did better math than I did. The Landesmuseum began cleaning the bones and wood. As their preparators cleaned the skeleton and removed a modern paint layer, they revealed another mystery underneath: old painted numbers and letters on the feet and rib cage. These must have been used to assemble and disassemble the skeleton during travel, but what part of the mastodon's mysterious history are these from? Another interesting detail emerged after cleaning: a faux painted layer on the wooden replica ribs. This sturdy paint layer is probably oil paint and looks like imitation bone, perhaps painted to unify the wooden ribs with the mastodon bone. Charles Willson Peale was first and foremost a painter. Could these be his brushstrokes from 1801? We don't know. I just find this stuff really interesting. One more thing before we get to our last couple paragraphs here. This is where I found out. It took going to at least a dozen different links on this when I came up with more than one set of mastodon bones. Peale worked methodically, making every attempt to preserve the bones. His methods became the basis of the new sciences of paleontology, zoology, and museum studies. Previously, when objects were found buried, they were dug up in a haphazard manner, leading to deterioration and destruction of the object. So he's really good at getting it out. 35 paid workers, that's the same as the resource guide, carefully dug around the bones, pulling them out of the water and mud. When their water got too deep, he created a hand-operated bucket and wheel system, and that's what the painting is depicting, to empty the pit, allowing the men to continue to dig. Peale and one of his sons, Rembrandt, sketched and did extensive research on the bones during excavation. Here's where we diverge from the art resource guide. Brief sip of water. While the scientific historic accomplishments of the excavation were important to Peale, his main objective was to uncover all the bones so he could reassemble the skeleton and exhibit it in his museum back in Philadelphia. It would be the second skeleton ever reassembled. And this is where I found the word megatherium for an enormous ground sloth in Madrid. Prior to his arrival at the site, some local men had retrieved a few bones which Peale was able to negotiate for eventual purchase. Peale described his discussion with the owner of the farm, Mr. Maston, in his diary, remarking, quote, "Completing the skeleton was an object of vast magnitude with me." The excavation project drew large crowds of people, with many onlookers turning up to watch the dig to see the bones and the sketches. Peale wrote in his diary, "It was pleasing circumstance to me that everybody seemed rejoiced that the bones had fallen into my hands." He corresponded with his friend, Thomas Jefferson, during and after the excavation. He had financial support for the American Philosophical Society. Few people were not excited. This is a brief little funny story. Dr. Hossack of New York told Peale that the bones should remain in the state of New York, which Peale replied, "Give me sufficient encouragement, and I would bring them and the museum also to New York. I was a citizen of the world and would go to that place which would give me most encouragement to my favorite science." And then another guy, Briggs, is upset that Peale isn't working. He's supposed to be working on efficient cooking designs to redesign his kitchen, and instead his emphasis is on the mastodon. Here's where it gets really differing from the art resource guide. The mastodon was eventually assembled and displayed at Peale's Philadelphia Museum on December 24th, 1801. Here's the museum. The exhibit proved extremely popular. His expenses for the excavation were $2,000. So we originally $300. Well, that was the initial. It went up to $2,000 total. He was able to recoup $1,831. Wow, this is really detailed, right? From 1802, in 1802. And how do you do that? By charging an extra 50 cents for visitors to see only the mastodon, not the rest of the museum. By 1811, the mastodon exhibition had grossed $7,000, so he more than made back his investment. By 1806, he memorialized his efforts in the excavation in his painting, The Exhumation of the Mastodon. Yeah. here, let's see. Yeah. This is the interesting stuff that the art resource guide should have included to me. Peale actually discovered enough bones to reassemble 2 mastodons. Technically 1 3/4 because they had to create artificial stuff, but they did reassemble 2 mastodons from these bones. The first mastodon can be found in Hessisches Landesmuseum in Germany. That's the one that is now back in the United States on loan. The mastodon at the Baltimore Museum was eventually dismantled and dispersed, with some of the bones going to the Smithsonian. These were returned to the Peale Museum in 1954. From December 1st, 1990 through June 30th, 1992, a fiberglass reproduction of the mastodon reprised its central role at the Peale Museum in Baltimore for the exhibition Mermaids, Mummies, and Mastodons, the Evolution of the American Museum. This exhibition recreated Peale's museum for the early 1800s, complete with gaslight fixtures, curiosities, and of course the mastodon, except it was a fiberglass reproduction of the mastodon, not the actual mastodon. So it's kind of interesting. In 1997, the Maryland Historical Society obtained the replica skeleton, the exhumation of the mastodon, the painting, and the original bones when the Baltimore City Life Museum closed. That's why they had to pack everything up and disassemble it, because the museum closed. Finally, we find this out. Today, visitors can see the mastodon in all its glory on the first floor of the Maryland Historical Society Museum. The painting and the excavated bones are also on display. So I just find that kind of stuff interesting. One more bit, and this again comes back to the inferiority complex thing with art, literature, and music, and science. Boy, I've got a word here that's not, intake is the wrong word. I'll have to fix that. Intact, that should be intact. I'm going to fix that right now because that bothers me. Intact. Intact? No. I can't spell. There we go. I like that so much better. Oops. Doesn't like some of my fonts. Oh well. The recovery of a nearly intact mastodon skeleton was both a scientific coup and a point of national pride. French scientist Georges-Louis Leclerc, the Comte de Buffon, had claimed in his volume of natural history that North American animals were inferior and degenerate versions of European animals. Our animals are bigger and better than your animals, and I fought in your general direction. Jefferson, our president, published a refutation of these claims in 1785, oh, before he was president, sorry, citing mastodon bones that Peale discovered as examples of an animal bigger than any found in Europe. Mastodons are unique to North America, cannot be found in Europe. So, we got mastodons and you don't. And mastodons are different from mammoths, and we can go down that rabbit hole if you'd like. The reason why I went down a little bit of several resources said it was French scientist Georges Buffon. And then in the resource guide, it's Georges-Louis Leclerc. Well, it's the same guy. This is the guy who was insulting our nature. Georges-Louis Leclerc, the Count of Buffon, the Comte de Buffon, all right? And so it's the same guy, Georges-Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon. He's the one that said, New World degeneracy or American degeneracy theory. He formulated, he said, the history of the earth and organisms that inhabit it, according to Buffon, a set number of distinct types of life generated near a central point. He suggested that species then underwent change as they migrated, affected by their new environments. In a way, Buffon was proposing a sort of proto-evolutionary hypothesis nearly 100 years before Darwin. The Count argued that all animals in the New World were degenerate compared to those in the Old World. Quote, animated nature, therefore, is less active, less varied, and even less vigorous. For by the enumeration of the American animals, we shall perceive that not only the number of species is smaller, but that in general they are inferior in size to those of the old continent. They're literally claiming that theirs are bigger than ours. It's a giant male pissing contest. Cold and humid environments, Buffon maintained, led life to degenerate. Landmass of the New World, he believed, had been underwater for a much longer period than the Old World. Therefore, North America was a relatively new continent that had not had time to heat up or dry out. The result was a cold continent with an extraordinarily humid land and stagnant swamps everywhere. According to Count, only insects and reptiles could flourish in such an environment. Consequently, humans, whom the Count thought had migrated to the continent via a land bridge that once connected Eurasia with North America, and domesticated animals brought to America, were doomed to be smaller and feebler. American Indians were responsible for the increase in humidity and the rate of degeneration, as they had failed to drain the swamps. And now we could get political. It just goes on and on. But that's why Americans had this giant inferiority complex, and we start trying to outdo Europeans in our art and our literature and our music and the size of our armies, what have you. So one thing leads to another.
I love it. I posted a link about what a difference is between a mastodon and a mammoth a little earlier. So that is in the chat if you can't see it. I just Googled difference between mastodon and mastiff. Mastiff. Yeah, that's good. Excellent. The mastodon and the mammoth. And I got something from the National Park Service.
Cool.
That talks about it. Essentially, they are both variations on the theme of elephant.
It's kind of like last time when I was researching horses, and it's like, well, they became extinct in North America twice. Once 25,000 years ago, and then 11,000 years ago, and the current version is Spanish version. It's like, whatever. Okay.
Exactly. So, well, awesome. All right. Well, let me stop the recording and answer any questions. We are left with just Aiden and Jack because Jesse had to jump on the airplane. But thank you and have a wonderful week. And we will talk to you again on Monday of next week.
And I'm going to spend the next few days posting to my YouTube and sending links out to all of the previously recorded things so it's easier for everybody to view. I got behind in my anthropology.
Nobody is judging you at all. All right, let me stop the recording.
All right.